I want to go now to Labor's Matt Thistlethwaite, who joins us from the Sydney CBD. Thanks for joining us, Matt. A lot to talk about today, really, in the economic sphere. I'm interested in your take on suggestions, apparently from Treasury modelling, Treasury advice, that this issue of wage stagnation, there's not enough wages growth, everybody's talking about it. In the election campaign, a lot of discussion about how to stimulate it, but apparently Treasury is blaming us. We're to blame for our own wages stagnation because we're not changing jobs enough. We all should be, moving jobs a bit to create a little bit more competition in the marketplace. That's a bit rich, isn't it?
I think it's preposterous, Chris, for Treasury to be pointing the finger at blaming workers for the problems with low wages in Australia at the moment. This is a very serious issue, not only for families and workers, but for the Australian economy in general, because it's fueling an underinvestment in consumption, if you like, and it's a drag on the economy. But to say that workers, particularly low to middle income workers, aren't changing jobs frequently enough is simply wrong in my view. If you're a low-paid worker with a couple of kids to feed, the risk associated with leaving a job in this sort of workplace environment is too high, and it's wrong to be blaming those sort of workers for problems in the economy and for the government's real lack of action on this issue nationally.
Realistically, I suppose people right across the workforce know sometimes that the best way to get a pay rise is to switch jobs, or to at least threaten to switch jobs. But conversely, the wood is on employers, isn't it? If you've got good employees, if you want to reward loyalty, if you want to continue to make use of their experience, then you should be looking to increase their wages when and if you can.
Yeah, the happiest workforces are the ones where employers invest in the futures of their workers through education, through training opportunities, and of course through fair and decent conditions and remuneration. And what we've seen in Australia over the course of the last 5 or 6 years is company profits increasing at a generous rate, but unfortunately wages growth has been quite sluggish, and it's stuck around that 2% mark. You've had the Reserve Bank Governor come out and say we need to get wages growing at a higher pace if we're going to have any prospect of growing the economy at the trend level into the future. So I think that there needs to be a greater focus on this from the Morrison government to boost wages in this economy and make sure that people have greater opportunities for incomes growth into the future.
Isn't there prescription for this right, though, by trying to increase economic growth, by underpinning infrastructure spending around the country, by trying to invigorate small business with tax cuts, by trying to reduce energy prices, by backing in the Reserve Bank with its interest rate cuts? I mean, it's about stimulating economic growth. That's how we're going to drive wages growth, isn't it?
Well, we don't believe that the government's doing enough to stimulate the economy, and I think that the Reserve Bank has signalled that in the Governor's comments a couple of weeks ago, saying that it can't be left to monetary policy to provide that stimulus. The government has to provide some of that as well. We believe that the tax cuts didn't go far enough, that they should have brought forward stage 2 of those tax cuts to ensure that every Australian worker gets a boost in their incomes and can spend that in the economy into the future. On infrastructure investment, we believe that the government hasn't brought forward enough of that infrastructure investment to begin almost immediately, if not into the forward estimate period. Anthony Albanese has been pointing out a commitment that's been made by the Morrison government to build a new road project in the electorate of Petrie in Queensland. It doesn't start till 2027. And that's a lot of their projects. About a third of them haven't started yet. They start beyond the forward estimates. And that's the problem with this government at the moment. They're not investing in infrastructure. And when you talk about energy policy, well, for the last 6 years, all they've done is argue and bicker with each other. They don't have a national approach to energy policy, and Australian consumers have been paying the cost through higher electricity prices.
We sure have been paying the costs through electricity prices, but they've made a few moves there, and it's starting to get under control. There's a lot more left to happen in that regard. While you mention energy, then what do you think of Bob Brown now protesting against a wind farm on Robbins Island in Tasmania? Does it show he's a hypocrite, or does it show that there are legitimate concerns about wind turbines?
Look, I think it's a bit of a contradictory argument from Bob Brown. He's been someone that has in the past promoted renewable sources of energy. He certainly went to Queensland on the tour during the election campaign promoting renewable energy. I'm not aware of the details of the planning nature of that proposal, but it's my view that where renewable energy projects meet all of their planning approvals and in the interests of providing additional supply of energy into the grid, then we should be supporting those types of projects.
So you'd back wind farms in your electorate? I can imagine a bunch of wind turbines out there on the Maroubra headland.
Look, we've had a turbine actually out on Malabar Headland in the past, Chris.
Well, why don't you get a dozen big ones out there? Back that in.
Look, as long as there's proper community consultation, as long as it meets all of the planning approvals and it generates a benefit for the community in terms of cheaper electricity, all of those projects are worthy of consideration.
There you heard it. The member for Kingsford Smith backing in a wind farm for the Malabar Headland. I think you're going to be safe on that one. I reckon air traffic control at the Sydney airport would probably rule them out on that location. But it does highlight, doesn't it? There's a lot of people talk about the lovey, touchy-feely business of renewable energy, but very few communities want a wind farm in their backyard.
Well, we do need more renewable energy. That's a fact. And what's important is that proponents of those projects follow the planning guidelines, but importantly, Chris, do proper consultation. And that's the key, I think, that if you can sit down with the community and explain the benefits of a particular project and indeed dispel some of the myths associated with them, if there are questions that people have, that you can win community support for renewable energy projects. And it's something that we need to be doing more of, in my view, in Australia, if we're going to reduce energy prices over the coming years, because we need more renewables in the system. The cost of renewables is coming down. It's certainly where the private sector is keen to invest into the future, and we need to get the balance right and make sure that the planning approvals are right.
If it's so cheap, maybe we could stop subsidising it. Speaking of emissions-free electricity generation, where are you, Matt Thistlethwaite, when it comes to nuclear energy? Do you buy the argument that, for instance, former Prime Minister, the late, great Bob Hawke, has long argued that Australia should get involved in nuclear energy?
Labor doesn't support the generation of nuclear energy in Australia at the moment. And there
shouldn't even examine it? Shouldn't even look at it, have an inquiry to examine the options?
Well, a number of state governments have had a look at it, most notably the South Australian government recently, and there are a number of questions, notably where you put them, and again this raises issues of local communities and the risks associated with them, but also what you do with the waste. And I don't believe that the world and scientists have adequately solved that issue of what is a highly radioactive waste when the process is still continuing, what you do with that waste into the future. And that's something that the world hasn't grappled with yet. And until we can be more comfortable with that, I think you're going to have problems with local communities supporting nuclear energy in Australia.
Thanks for joining us, Matt. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.